A 30-day halt to strikes on energy facilities by Russia and Ukraine. That appears to be the outcome of a lengthy phone call between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin on March the 18th. According to statements from the White House and the Kremlin, both sides agree this conflict needs to end with a lasting peace. They also agreed to immediately start technical negotiations on implementing a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. But President Putin did not agree to the 30-day truce proposed purportedly by the United States, stressing the unconditional need to eliminate the root causes of the crisis and take into account Russia's security interests. It is reported that Ukraine supports the scaled-back agreement but is seeking more details. Ending the Ukraine war has been one of President Trump's day one campaign pledges. So how significant was this phone call? What are the details of this conversation? And what is China's principal position on such initiatives? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. I'm pleased to be joined from Washington, D.C. by Anton, Fedyashin, Associate Professor at the History Department of American University. From North Carolina by Klaus, Larres, Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, also a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And I'm joined from Beijing by Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategies of China. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So first of all, as they say, the devil lies in the details. So let's look at the details. But first of all, I want to go to Professor Fedyashin. How do you see the sincerity or how genuine is the Trump administration in terms of pursuing this truce negotiation? He talked about a contract for peace. Is this another business deal for him?
It most certainly is a business deal for Donald Trump, but that doesn't take away from the sincerity with which he approaches it. His transactional approach to diplomacy is really great power attitude to international relations, which depends on interests of sovereign states, balance of power calculations, spheres of influence, if they apply. And Donald Trump seems to be reverting to the sort of more traditional 19th century and maybe even early 20th century calculations. But the one thing that we can say for sure about him is that he does have a visceral opposition to wars, especially if they have absolutely no bearing on vital American national security interests. And Trump is operating on the assumption that Ukraine is such a war.
Well, if the other two guests have different opinions, you're welcome to voice that. But I'm going to push further for the details as to exactly what were agreed upon by the two sides, regardless of whether they are both genuine, whether they're both sincere in their pursuit of a lasting peace. And I want to talk about this 30-day halt on Ukraine energy facility strikes. That's been reinterpreted by some media. However, I do find it a bit perplexing because some are saying energy and infrastructure, some are saying energy infrastructure. Professor Klaus, what's your reading of the outcome?
Yeah, back in October, President Zelensky actually suggested to go for a partial ceasefire, but the Americans, President Trump, did not really want to know about it. He wanted to go for full ceasefire. And now in the phone call with President Putin, he had to agree to a partial ceasefire. That partial ceasefire refers above all to energy. A lot of people say it's energy infrastructure, so it only regards power plants and similar, while some interpreters say it means civilian infrastructure and energy plants. My own reading is that it really refers to energy infrastructure, because civilian infrastructure was immediately attacked again by Russian drones as soon as the phone call ended. So that would have contradicted what the two men just talked about. Still, it's a partial ceasefire, which is better than nothing. It is, of course, not a full ceasefire. It's not a lasting peace by any stretch of the imagination, but perhaps it's the beginning of something bigger.
Dr. Zhao, what is your reading of, first of all, the sincerity of the Russian side on pursuing a lasting peace, going into these talks, let's not call it a negotiations yet, and what was agreed upon? Because the White House puts it energy and infrastructure. What is your understanding?
Well, my reading is that the Russian side is more sincere than the United States because U.S. and particularly President Trump wants a political win, and he wants a immediate ceasefire. And as long as he can achieve peace, it's beneficial to him. However, we all know to achieve a serious ceasefire, there's a lot of steps to be taken, a lot of preparations. And right now, there's a very long line of fighting between the two sides. And therefore, there's a lot of details needs to be worked out. So I think for that matter, President Putin is very serious about talking about a final ceasefire. But before that, there needs to be steps on both sides to exchange POWs, for instance, to achieve maybe partial ceasefire, and then to work out exactly during the ceasefire, both sides, what can be done and what should not be doing on both sides. For instance, a resupply and starting or preparing for a war after the ceasefire. So again, I think in order to achieve long-term sustainable peace, there's a very complex process. Both sides, I mean, all the sides participating needs to go through.
And
I have a slightly different.
okay, go ahead, Klaus.
I do not think that at this stage Putin is very serious. He wants to delay coming to a full ceasefire. He had to give in to some sort of agreement because President Trump was pushing him hard, and Putin also doesn't want to endanger the current rapprochement with the United States, which suits him very nicely because he, like Trump, wants to be the big guy on the world scene who can shake and move and bring things about. But Putin really wants to delay because he's at the moment quite successful on the battlefield. He's just recaptured Kursk and has driven out the Ukrainians. He's making some advantages he has in the eastern Donbass region. And so he doesn't see the reason why now he's actually winning a little bit on the battlefield. He should make concessions and enter into some sort of compromise deal regarding Ukraine. So he wants to string Trump
Dr. Zhao, you want to react to this? Yeah.
Well, with respect, I think particularly because Putin from the very beginning talking about comprehensive, long-lasting, sustainable peace, and therefore ceasefire alone cannot achieve that. So therefore, if only to achieve 30-day ceasefire is not the goal of Putin. Of course, on the battlefield, the Russian side is now having the advantage, and they can march further down into Ukraine. But I think in his mind, a political settlement, particularly to reconstruct a peace, a security framework across Europe is the most important thing, and therefore. I don't think even partial ceasefire means that he's not sincere about ultimately achieving peace.
May I just quickly reply? And I would like to say a lasting peace could have been achieved by not invading in the first place. Russia invaded Ukraine. If it hadn't invaded, there would be no war. So now to talk about achieving a lasting peace after you first invade, this is a little cynical and really be taken.
Let's not get into what happened in the past in the first place. You cannot reverse the clock here. Dr. Zhao, you want to react, or is this you think this is an emotional statement? You'd rather talk about what can be done at this moment?
Well, of course, it's important to talk about the origin of the war because in the end, if we wanted to end the war and make it lasting, then the root cause of the war needs to be addressed. And of course, the Russians sort of started this conflict, calling it a special military operation, but then there's also reasons on the Russian side. So, I mean, from China's perspective, at this point,
this war didn't
it's
start.
Not that important.
This war didn't start 3 years ago. This war didn't start 3 years ago.
Of
we
course,
have to,
it's
we have
very
to
complex.
That's why
again, this process is should be very long.
That's why can we try to understand the Russian need, which was stressed by President Putin, that there's an unconditional need to eliminate the root causes of the crisis and take into account Russia's security interests. Mr. Anton, do you think at this moment the conditions are being met?
Well, this is the first step. And as we know, and I think it's a Chinese saying, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. So, yes, we seem to be moving in that direction. Let's see if this partial truce holds. But going back to this question of the fundamental conditions, this goes to the root of what Klaus and Dr. Zhao were just discussing, which is where this whole conflict started and where it came from. And from the Russian perspective, this conflict actually started when bodies started dropping in the middle of Kiev back in February of 2014, when there was a violent and illegal coup d'etat to remove a democratically elected Ukrainian president, and then the whole move towards NATO. This is not just the Russian perspective. I mean, we could dismiss it if that argument only came from Moscow. But back in 2008, the American ambassador to Moscow, William Burns, sent back to the State Department a famous telegram, which is known as "Niet means niet, no means no," in which he warned that pulling Ukraine into NATO would spark a civil war in the country and then pull the Russians in to intensify it. And things have unfolded exactly as Ambassador Burns predicted back in 2008. He, by the way, then became the CIA director under Joe Biden, and really is one of the most accomplished American diplomats of this century. So the root cause ultimately is NATO and spheres of influence. NATO is trying to pull Ukraine into its sphere of influence with the EU association agreement. The Russians started reacting, and here we are. So this is why Putin is talking about the root causes now. Whether such a broad recalibration and reinterpretation of European and even more widely Eurasian security can be achieved with the Europeans and with the Americans, that's a more philosophical question. Unfortunately, the Europeans lately have not only taken themselves out of the equation by essentially making themselves fully dependent on decisions made in Washington, but they're sort of playing the role of the spoiler right now with even this partial ceasefire.
Talking about the Europeans, I do want to talk about their reaction. For instance, European leaders, even ahead of this conversation, have shown total skepticism towards any reliability on the Russian side, saying Putin's talk of peace is a mirage, for instance. That's one of the messages they were sending, and that they cannot be trusted. And European foreign policy chief actually says Russia doesn't really want peace. Klaus, how do you look at the reactions of Europeans towards an effort for ending this war?
Well, first of all, the Europeans should, of course, be participating in any talks. It shouldn't just be Trump and Putin. Zelensky has been absent from any serious talks, the trilateral talks. The Europeans have been absent, and this is not justified, shouldn't really be the case, because as Anton said at the beginning, Trump likes to go back to the 19th century, great power politics of the 19th century. This should not be feasible. So, of course, the Europeans are quite skeptical about that phone call, and they don't trust the Russians. After all, as we just discussed, the Russians invaded in 2014, 2022. So it is difficult to now have an element of trust that whatever Putin says or promises, that he will actually stick to it instead of using the opportunity to rearm.
So you seem to put the blame squarely on the Russians, Klaus. That's what I'm reading, because you seem to put the blame squarely on the Russians. So anything that the Russian says is not to be trusted. Anything that Russia does is not going to, is not good, is not trustworthy. With that kind of mentality, it's very difficult to come to any deal, Klaus.
No, not at all. You have to come to a deal which is properly supervised, which is properly guaranteed, so that people are not can just
That's
make
what Russia
promises.
has been calling for. That's actually what President Putin called for this time.
And the grievances Russia has about NATO expansion, these grievances are not unjustified, and they need to be addressed. This is, I think, also seen by the Europeans. However, when Putin talks about the Nazi regime in Kiev and wants to really topple and get rid of Zelensky, a democratically elected president, he has no point whatsoever.
Okay, so you're again blaming on the Russian side for this, but that's you have the right to decide to believe in what you say. Dr. Zhao, Dr. Zhao, what is your take of the role of European leaders? They're not clearly involved in this process. But whose decision is this? Why are they not at the table? And Ukraine, too.
Well, ultimately, I think Europeans will have a say on the outcome of this conflict. However, I think at this particular stage, if we want to move forward with the current negotiation, I think it's the United States, and particularly President Trump, is taking the right approach, which is to talk to the Ukrainians, talk to the Russians separately, and then trying to bridge their differences and push step by step towards a acceptable deal by both sides, and then ultimately bring the Europeans in terms of guaranteeing future peace. But at that point, I don't think it's useful to pull everybody onto the same table and start talking. There must be some kind of quarrel and then going separate ways. So I think in order to achieve peace, this step-by-step ceasefire is probably needed at this point, because there, as Mr. Klaus pointed out, there's very low trust on each side. So how do you construct and build trust back? That's a critical question, and I think starting with a partial ceasefire may be a possible approach.
Talking about the approach to the negotiations, actually, Kremlin, according to reliable media reports of the original Russian press release in Russian, Kremlin actually says they also agree to continue resolving the crisis through bilateral channels, and they will set up a special expert group for the task. Anton, how do you read this message? Basically, they're saying we're willing to talk and progress along the same line.
That's right. And the bigger questions in here is what comes first? Is it the Ukraine issue that is really at the center of Trump's and Putin's interests? Or is it bilateral relations between Washington and Moscow? Because the signals are constantly being either mixed or they are being sent out at the same time, which makes me wonder about what the bulk of the conversation today and on previous telephone calls and meetings was about. Because the readout that I looked at from the White House mentions improved bilateral relationship between Moscow and Washington, which has a huge upside, and I'm quoting, including enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability when peace has been achieved. Now, this is very important because although Ukraine is at the forefront of everyone's attention, which is understandable, there seems to be a lot more going on in these discussions than just the peace in Ukraine. As a matter of fact, it may be that the issue of the war in Ukraine is a litmus test. It's the barometer of the actual focus of the talks, which is restoring the bilateral relationship between Moscow and Washington. And if that is the case, then I understand why the Europeans are reacting in such a frantic and alarmed manner, because they're seeing Washington and Moscow establish direct communications, which is exactly what Brussels refused to establish with Moscow over the past 3 years. And on this issue of where Europe stands on the peace, look, we just had the Munich Security Conference, and on the sidelines, Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, gave an interview, and she said openly that right now peace is worse than war in Ukraine. And that can be said, unfortunately, to represent the bulk, not all, but the bulk.
But that doesn't seem to be the position of Ukraine, right? The funny thing is, Ukraine seems to have already accepted Americans' broker's role, and it is reported that President Trump came with Ukraine's agreement to a 30-day truce or 30-day halt on attack on infrastructure and energy facility before he went into talk with President Putin. So Ukraine is actually coming along with the United States, and Professor Anton. So that's really strange here.
Well, actually, no. I don't think that's that strange for two reasons. First of all, the Ukrainians are willing to deal with the Russians because they are in the weaker position right now. Their incursion into Kursk has been completely defeated and almost fully rolled back, and they're retreating across the line and losing massive amounts of soldiers. And that's number one. Number two, of course, Trump gets what he wants because Ukraine is completely dependent on the West, especially on the United States. And Trump made a very powerful and very cynical point by withholding, at least temporarily, both weapons supplies and intelligence sharing. And that sent a very painful signal to Kiev that if it doesn't move towards some kind of agreement with the Russians, then it will end up on the losing side of the war altogether.
Let's again look at the White House statement concerning bilateral relationship. And the readout says the two leaders, President Trump and President Putin, agreed that a future with an improved bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia has huge upside, just as what Anton cited just now. And this includes enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability when peace has been achieved. Klaus, how do you look at the broader implication of this conversation on both the economic perspective and geopolitical perspective? How do you look at this?
Yeah, I think I largely agree with what was just said. I think Ukraine as such plays a relatively small role in Trump's mind. He wants to achieve peace in Ukraine, but for larger means. And first of all, he wants to go down in history as a peacemaker. We all know he has the ambition to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's serious about that. He really wants to create peace. And he doesn't really care too much about the conditions and the concessions he has to make. I'm not saying he wants to make all sorts of concessions, but he is prepared to go very far. Secondly, he wants to achieve the good consequences from creating peace in Ukraine. This is much improved economic relations with Russia, gas and energy deliveries. There even was talk at the talks in Saudi Arabia recently that perhaps American investors will revive the Nord Stream 2 and 1 pipeline and facilitate cheap Russian gas deliveries to Europe once again. Of course, the Europeans have not yet been consulted about that. But it clearly indicates what Trump has in mind goes well beyond Ukraine, but he needs Ukraine or peace in Ukraine to achieve these larger ambitions, not least of himself as going down in world history as a peacemaker.
Mr. Zhao Hai, going forward, the two sides will continue to have immediately technical discussions concerning maritime ceasefire. So that part will go on. They will establish a task force of experts to talk about some of the issues, to follow on some of the issues. Do you think the momentum of conversation, of engagement will hold, that it's going to lead to some kind of stepping stone to an eventual ceasefire or a contract for peace, as in President Trump's words?
Well, I certainly hope so, because as you described, first of all, we still don't know exactly how energy or energy facility or energy and infrastructure ceasefire will carry out. And also, they're going to talk about the technical details of Black Sea ceasefire, but how will that carry out is also a problem. But if that's being successfully carried out, then that's a very good sign that two sides will move closer towards a complete, comprehensive ceasefire. And then the real negotiation will start. But again, from China's perspective, China has long advocated for the Ukraine conflict not spill over towards the world. And Black Sea maritime route is very important for a global food energy supply. And if we can maintain peace across Black Sea, then that's not only significant for the conflict in Ukraine, but also significant for global commodity trade.
Let's talk about China's position, as you mentioned it. Actually, earlier this year, early March, China's top diplomat, Mr. Wang Yi, said at an annual press conference that China welcomes and supports all efforts for peace, this is a message that's been reiterated on various occasions. And he said, in hindsight, the tragedy could have been avoided. All parties should learn something from the crisis. Dr. Zhao, would you elaborate a little bit on exactly what his message is that, for instance, what can Europeans learn from it? What can Russian learn from it? What can Ukraine learn from it?
Well, I think China's message is very clear that we should give more opportunity, more chances to diplomacy. And we believe that diplomacy is not very well done or fully executed before this conflict. And when Russia talking or sending message to the NATO countries and to the United States in particular, the Biden administration didn't take Putin seriously and only sending out the warning of the coming conflict. And also for European countries, even though they participated in the Minsk 1 and 2 agreement, however, they're not giving enough pressure on the Ukrainian side to seriously abide by that agreement, which give a reason, for instance, to the Russian side as well. So that will give lessons to the future agreements. For instance, if we can achieve some kind of conditions for peace, then how to supervise that peace and what happens to, if some other things happen across the continent, then how do we maintain peace using maximizing the power of diplomacy. I think that's the most important thing. And that comes to China's global security initiative, because we think that using force to resolve any conflict is not legitimate under the UN Charter and international law.
Well, as we speak, right, there is renewed strikes on Gaza by Israel, although there was some kind of ceasefire. Anton, looking forward, what do you see as the biggest factor X when we're looking at how smooth, how much momentum this process is going to gather?
Actually, it will be Europe's role, I think. First of all, yes, I agree with Klaus. The Europeans should definitely be at the negotiating table. Unfortunately, the only leaders in Europe who were willing to engage with the Russians diplomatically were Viktor Orban and Robert Fico of Slovakia, and we saw how they were treated by the EU leadership for doing so. But the faster the Europeans come to the table, the better it will be for everyone, even though it may be difficult for some of the European leaders to actually swallow their pride and admit that severing diplomatic ties with Moscow ended up playing in its favor in Ukraine. So the faster the Europeans get into it, the better. And the question of when that will happen is the biggest X for me, the unresolved question.
Klaus, what is your take? This for the White House, this is only the beginning, yeah. But do you think for the Russians, they will be willing to engage as well? Despite your mistrust in them.
Yeah. I do. I'm very mistrustful, as are many other people. But in the end, Putin will also have no option but to engage. He will try to delay it, but eventually he will have to come to the negotiating table. And I think we should all agree that an independent, free and independent Ukraine should continue to exist, and Putin should accept that as well. And then we have to talk about the necessary security guarantees. And here the Europeans and other countries, neutral countries, United Nations, play an important role. We need to secure that peace, which hopefully will evolve in Ukraine over the next few weeks and months. Without these security guarantees, we cannot guarantee that the peace will be lasting.
Yeah, Dr. Zhao Hai, what will you be watching out for?
Well, ultimately, this agreement must be balanced and satisfying both sides' security concerns. So, on the one hand, we will have an independent but neutral Ukraine, but at the same time, Russians also needs to, get its security concerns addressed. But at the same time, promising not to do this again. So, I think ultimately, we hope that ceasefire will lead to a peace treaty or agreement.
Let's keep a close watch on the situation, but at least the first step seems to have been taken. Many thanks to my guest, Anton Fedyashin, Associate Professor at the History Department of American University, Klaus Larres, Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank you for having watched this edition of The Point with me, Lu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Lu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got the point.